How are you doing? You too. How are you? Of course, we have to. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Yeah.
Morning again, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Election Administration and Management 10. My name is Andrew Songa. I am from the European Partnership for Democracy, Regional Advisor on African Union Engagement, but for this purposes, I am the chair of this session, which is really just guiding the conversation forward. So, we have about 2 panelists we are hoping to join us shortly, but I guess we have enough forum to sort of proceed. And so thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the panelists who already answered us. Just to take a quick roll call, and one of the panelists, Jane, reminded me this is a bit of a reunion for some of us who haven't been around this conversation for a bit, but now happy to be back. We have Jen Serwanga from UNDP, who's also been a consummate expert around electoral governance affairs, and obviously from a current role has been supporting electoral management, electoral management body aids for quite a while. Also graciously, we have Professor Paul Kamau, head of IDS at the University of Nairobi, and also for me, good friend and colleague in matters of democratic governance. Some Pan-African projects we have in common. And then for me, as a first, a pleasure being with Peter Lingo, who met in person, but obviously also a veterans expert to contribute to this conversation. And then I believe we have an apology from Anne Katerina, who won't be able to join us for this session, but would have been on the panel. And I believe Angela will be joining us shortly. So I believe we all have access to the program to see the context in which we are trying to have this conversation that is focused on election administration and management. Obviously, building on what had been said within the early morning sessions, and particularly the matrix that was presented by Mullen. A couple of key questions for us to consider, because when we talk about election administration and management, I think it's also been at the heart of what I will unpack as part of the contention with our election. It attracts a little bit of resolution issues, or what's framed for electoral resolution. So within that is, I think we will reflect on issues around what some of the stakeholders involved in electoral administration and management have been engaged in, and how things can improve towards a particular certain action. So the judiciary obviously is at the heart of it. And the question would be, what lessons can we learn from the impact of the central role that has been played by the judiciary in electoral execution? How do we then engage with the IEDC's incoming leadership that is about to form now that we have a recruitment process that is underway, and monitoring the timeline of electoral activities? There's then the question of public communication and the issue of mistrust for the electoral management bodies. How do we then engage with the contemporary issues in that area, build more public confidence going into the next cycle of elections? And then what was eloquently highlighted earlier today, the role of technology in elections, whether it's transformation of results or now the new reality of artificial intelligence and what it can do. in various facets of the electoral process, whether it's campaigns, whether it's engaging with the public, or whether it's also streamlining some processes that are within the purview of the electoral management body. So before I sit down, I'll just use the opportunity to highlight or contextualize a couple of things that will help us then on these issues. Some of it highlighted. So, what backdrop are we having this conversation? Having this backdrop, I think this conversation against the backdrop of 3 elections post 2010, as has been highlighted by Felix in his presentation earlier today. And in those 3 elections, we are all well aware of certain cycles that have had 3 presidential election petitions, meaning every presidential election has been resolved finally at the court. Then we also, aligned with that, had 3 cycles of either reconfiguring or tinkering with the electoral management body, the electoral system resides over. By configuring or tinkering, I mean we've seen joint parliamentary committees that are formed in the aftermath of the 2013 election. Then we look at the legal framework, the institutional framework of the IEC. We then saw post 2017 something crystallizing the BPI that then was stopped by the courts. And then now we have MADCO that is informing the content of how we possibly navigate into the next electoral context. I've already mentioned the 3 petitions, so that means the judiciary, as I mentioned at the sector of electoral dispute resolutions. But then in those contexts, there's also been the public debate and perceptions about integrity of our elections. So it's been a lot of stakeholders who've influenced how we perceive our elections and what that format should be. And I think that does bring us to certain things to wonder as we talk about the management bodies, and I hope our panelists will be able to interact with that in certain ways. So when it comes to the judiciary, I think the pros we've seen is that judgments that have been pronounced by our courts, especially the apex of the Supreme Court, they have instigated the reforms and staved off conflict. By that I mean we've seen that from the judgments, specific aspects of electoral management brought into debate, resolutions, jurisprudence, and that jurisprudence has inspired either amendments to laws or how the electoral body proceeds. Certain processes, so like the transmission of results was influenced by the decisions that were made in 2017. By staving off conflict, I mean at least we've not seen the scale of conflict we saw in 2007 because primarily we've had increased trust in the judicial system to resolve the most contentious aspects of our elections, which are presidential results. But what are the cons of having the judiciary at the center of this? I think the cons can be summarized in the growing balance of the concern that has emerged around judicialization of politics and ultimately the politicization of judiciary. What does that essentially mean? It means that the judiciary is beginning to become more and more prominent in resolving what could be political contests and disputes. And as a result, it is now attracting the eye of political actors. And I think we can all agree that the judiciary is currently feeling considerable strain from the political arm of our society because partially of the role it can play in future electoral disputes. Then there's a question of the police, who's also critical stakeholder in electoral management because of their role of enforcing laws, especially during this high peak of electoral campaigns. And so the one question again is from experience and practice. Is the police considered an enforcer of laws, an enforcer of order, or are they agents of partisan interests? And again, that might be a question of factual experiences and also public perception that is in fact. And then there's the IBC itself. And I think the fundamental question is hearing what we had in the morning. Are they on a trajectory that can be said they are fit for purpose? Are they on a trajectory to be a body that will answer key questions that are taken. They will be transparent in the process, and they will be accountable in the processes that they undertake, and that they have in fact now to de-escalate issues that would turn into legal disputes amongst people who are contesting elections or stakeholders around the electoral process. And these questions, I think, are important because of some of the things we had. The question about delays when it comes to reforming the management code and how it can impact its execution of management. So we have delayed commission of recruitment. We have delayed aspects like budgeting, financing of its operations. If you have delays or even constitutional processes like boundary degrees, does that then create far-reaching ramifications around transparency? That and then finally, because we are talking also about public perceptions, public communication, those stakeholders who are involved in research around the public feeling perception around electoral democracy in general. I think the reflection point there would be, are the stakeholders creating an improved understanding of the political landscape and our democracy generally, or are they fomenting distrust in electoral strategies? Because I think one of the controversies, and this is why I'm hoping to see at electoral, one of the controversies that has emerged is we've seen how poorly it's treated, especially over the last month. They either create and they enforce an understanding of the political landscape in the sense that we trust what we are seeing when we eventually see electoral results, or they reinforce disputes because then people will say they don't trust the outcome of the election because of what they saw in terms of polling and in the country. So with that, as the backdrop and the purpose, I'm just going to be able to liberally open the floor to gain some insights from some of our panelists. And then, thank you for joining us. Was in terms of asking the question, do they create an improved understanding of the political landscape or are they fomenting distrust in electoral structures? What your feeling perceptions would be from the last few elections. So I want you to open it up to the panelists to give some of the initial thoughts. It's going to be an open disc conversation, so you can tackle the issues. I'm going to see it. There was no preordained understanding of who would kick us off in terms of the panelists. So I'm going to be very democratic about it. Look around who feels inspired. It's a very strong inspiration. And so if the spirit moves you, please kick us off.
Thank you very much, Narendra, for the highlights that are really key point to the issues that we address as highlights. And I just want to speak it from where I stopped and also tie that with sentiments that arose from the floor when one of the speakers was making remarks. That the only constant is change. When we look at our election management administration and everything that happens throughout the cycle. And you rightly said we had 3 cycles since the transformative constitution in 2010. And in all these 3 cycles, the elections that we had have generated contestations. Contestations that you can typically categorize as 1, elite contestation, and 2, popular contestation, that is people-driven contestation. And we tie that again with what came out from the floor when the remarks were made with regard to how do we deliberately move towards making our elections people-driven. And I want to divorce these 2 things. Separate elite contestations around elections and popular contestations around elections. Because elections are about the but politicians often process and take it away from people. How do we get elections to become a people's property that the people can be happy about, be part of, be engaged in, out of the spirit that you're talking about, so that people then become enthusiastic about their own elections to the extent that they can occupy themselves to be engaged, to work, and to support the electoral processes without pay. That, for me, is how we can deliberately move towards transforming our elections to become a process that is people inspired, that can be said to be fully people driven, and that can then be based on trust of the people. So that is fundamental. And again, when we talk about the contestations that we've seen in the last couple of elections, they have ended up in courts. In 2017, we were treated to even two contestations because we had two elections in July, right? So we see what you deliberately describe as judicialization of politics and politicization of the judiciary. And that brings me to the next point, the central role of the judiciary in our election management. And here I see two things that I would like to highlight. Actually, three. One, the role of the judiciary as the arbitrator. And two, the role of the judiciary as the initiator or driver of reforms in elections. Arbitrator, that would also include the role of the judiciary in dispute conflict resolution around our electoral processes. But what I want to pick, which is mostly important, is the role of the judiciary as the moderator of the electoral process. Because this is what has become to be described as the most trusted that the people can rely on to defend elections, to defend electoral processes. As the champion for defending human rights, which the judiciary is, it has increasingly become the hallmark of defending the people's rights in relation to elections. So the electoral rights that are now particularly a threat in the Constitution have become a matter of protection by permission of the Constitution. So if you look at the role of the moderator of people's interest in election, so the defender of this concept of popular people's engagement, involvement in contestation. So the judiciary therefore becomes the tool and the pillar and the mechanism through which popular people's driven contestation is public trust in the electoral process, then we are steadily driving towards building greater integrity in our electoral processes. Now, the next thing that I would want to talk about in terms of the role of the judiciary is that of validation. And this is both positive and negative. Positive in the sense that this is the validator of people's interest in elections. This is the validator of positive gains, positive processes in elections. But it is also negative in the sense that the IEBC is increasingly relying on the judiciary to validate electoral processes. So, in other words, the IEBC now tends to sit back. You know, in fact, one would critically, if you were to critically analyze it, you would say that the IEBC would deliberately engage in bad money, you know, mess up things. Okay. For example, draft regulations very late in the day, take them to parliament very late in the day, and then look for excuses, in the nature of conflict, fights between IEBC and JLAC and parliament. Who was late, who was not late, who was late, who was not late, and buy time, out of which at the end of the day, even the reforms that the judiciary, as the reformer, as the initiator of reformer, has instructed Parliament and IEBC to undertake is not undertaken in time. But the IEBC will just sit back and say, okay, if you don't like it, go to court. Go to court. And what do? They simply say, we will follow what the court says. So the validation factor which the judiciary brings in is negative in the sense that it allows IEBC to become lackluster instead of being proactive manager and administrator of elections. It allows IEBC to become lethargic, to take the necessary steps, even when it is clear. Because you ask yourself, what is it about integrity in election? It is nothing. You can name the number of laws that we have, from the Constitution to the other laws, Elections Act, IEBC Act, Political Parties Act. You can name about 20 laws with regulations to boost, So there is nothing that the IEBC lacks in terms of building integrity around elections. It's about the culture. Thank you. For my opening remarks.
Yes, so we'll come back to you, sure, definitely. But I think two things that have been triggered, what you've said, at least for me, that I'm hoping the wider group will also interact with is the pathway to better electoral management and administration is embodying a more people-driven electoral framework. I think, as you eloquently described. The question for me is then, what should IEBC do more concretely to then push us towards a people-driven framework? If you think about the different steps and modalities they've taken, whether it's around civic education, whether it's around how they diffuse their responsibilities from getting agents, etc., what can they change to make sure that we have a more people-driven approach to our elections? I think that's something we need to turn our attention to. And then when you talked about the judiciary, and I think you highlighted one aspect of what I was about to ask. From constantly being legal disputes that end up in court. I think one of the things you closed with is the burden doesn't lie endlessly on the court to safeguard our electoral integrity. I think it's something I hope others will engage with. So I would like to turn my attention to another panelist. I can see Professor Kamau, but I wanted us to alternate. And here Jane,
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew, and also to the previous speakers, all colleagues gathered here. I work at UNDP, which allow me to preface my interaction with saying that UNDP supports elections globally in about 170 countries. And the kind of support provided by UNDP is informed by many things. But very importantly, is any design of a UNDP support program is informed by what we call a needs assessment mission, where a team from HQ has the chance to speak to stakeholders nationally and identify the scope of the kind of support. Why am I saying this? It's to say that when UNDP is about to set up an election project, stakeholders such as yourselves are consulted to help identify the areas of focus that stakeholders feel. Which brings me to the point then of whether how we see, and in Kenya we've supported every election, every referendum since the return to multi-party elections. So happy for that partnership, but at all times we're driven by the need to ensure that it remains and it is seen to be a national process that is driven by Kenyans. So to the point of fitness for purpose, given our experience in working with the IBC is and talking to colleagues at the commission, their job is quite a difficult job, and I'm not purporting to speak for them. It's just interactions I have with them. And I recall once during an induction for commissioners where a question was asked, short but very profound. And the question they asked is, how do you protect us, now we're talking as staff at the commission, from political interference? I'm not so sure that answer was fully given, but I'm just trying to indicate that that becomes then a very key point. And the late Chebukati himself told us once that in his view, it doesn't matter who sits on that seat, as long as we have the kind of political interference we experience, it really makes the job somewhat of a poisoned chalice. But looking at it from our perspective and from the kind of support that we provide and has come out in I've read all the Electoral Observation Mission reports, and all of them, one thing is said again and again, not just from 2022, 2067, and going backwards, is IEBC needs to look inwards and work more around the area of how it communicates with members of the public. And this then brings the question of strategic communication. Because there are instances, and I recall, I think it was in 2018, when we saw the push and pull between the then chair Chebukati and the then CEO Ezra. And many times members of the public would find out information either from social media, from leaks that were happening. And when you don't have information being put out there by the leadership of the commission, strategically put out there, it leaves a lot of room for speculation. It leaves a lot of room in our current state for misinformation and for disinformation. Of course, we're aware there's information that is kept in the boardroom, but for us, and having spoken to a number of stakeholders and introspecting among ourselves, it's an area where we see and we feel, and I'm not committing UNDP as yet, but looking at our expertise around the globe, it's an area where we see a huge amount of investment that can be made by different stakeholders, just to ensure that there is adequate communication, that it's not being left to when a situation has fallen apart. Sometimes Kenyans want even to know about processes that are ongoing. And coupled with that is the element of engaging different stakeholders at different stages. So stakeholders would be anyone and everyone from the voting public to the political parties that we have, to even organizations like ours who provide the kind of electoral assistance that we provide. So therein is a space for that kind of investment so that Kenyans are not living off or thriving off the rumor mill. And in my view, if well done, and the technical experts that we provide for that kind of support, if well done and when well done, that itself is one of the things that could stave off cases of conflict, which we know and have seen escalate in different situations. So strategic communications, crisis communication, and a very close contact with members of the public by way of customer service. And connected to that, the other one that I really wanted to talk about is if you look back at 2024 and the Gen Z led protest that we had, one of the things, and for us in the sector, we say something that the Gen Z protests were very humbling to us who have been in the sector for a while, because the Gen Z showed and confirmed that they can analyze information, put it out there in almost record time. 1 minute we're watching the president deliver a speech. In less than 2 hours, they have churned out their analysis. And why am I saying this? It's to say that it then becomes critical for the commission and other electoral stakeholders that as we move to 2027, the use of technology is such a key piece, and we talk about it all the time. But even if you look at the different tools that were used by the youth last year, it's to say that situations like voter education, voter information, all of these, and that's cost effective as well, right? When you apply technology in terms of the voter education information, you don't have to fully convene people in gatherings like we have. But we know they're still important for the traditional gatherings to be happen, because we're also quite aware of the digital divide and the fact that not everybody in the country has access to the kind of technology that we're talking about. So that's my second point, that this engagement happened.
What did you say?